What's sex therapy? Well, it's not entirely about sex. It's mostly about relationships, relationship to self and relationship to others. It's also about wounding that affects our relationship to self, how we feel about ourselves, what we think about ourselves. So in your relationship to self is how secure do you feel in who you are? How valuable do you feel you are? Because that affects the way we interpret things. And a lot of times the way we interpret things is not completely 100% reflective of reality. And so it creates dynamics that just don't work, that are conflictual and disappointing. So let's say you have wounding around feeling desirable. Maybe you have a history of being kind of like the odd person out, or you weren't very desirable, or didn't have many people that wanted to go out with you, for example. And so that made you feel like there was something wrong with you. And so that kind of imprints on you, becomes a wound, and your life is kind of affected, especially if that wound is deep, by this idea that I'm not desirable. So imagine you get into a relationship where the person's desire has gone away. That is very threatening to you because of these past wounds. And so that's one way past wounding gets in the way of having the things that we want. On the flip side of things, maybe another person would be affected by wounding of being kind of like not listened to or ignored or objectified or kind of trampled on. So that wounding for that person might mean like, oh, I am not valuable enough. And so when they get into a relationship, especially with a person that has this wounding around not being valuable, it begins to look like the only value is their sexual value. So that person coming to them with the anxiety around, I want to have sex because I want to feel accepted by you, I want to feel desired by you, and that suddenly for that person that has the wounding of being trampled over feels like, I'm getting trampled over, and that makes them move back and reject the person. And that just feeds on this cycle that's kind of like a negative snowball. It just keeps on getting worse and worse. So emotional wounding makes us react in a heightened way to things compared to people that don't have that particular wound. It's important in sex therapy to address that, because if you don't address that, then you're missing the point. That's kind of like the basis of where the problems lie. And so the wounding, past wounding or present wounding, relational wounding, it's really important. The second thing that gets in the way of a person having more sexual desire is relational conflict. Some people, especially the ones with responsive desire, shut down. The desire just shuts down when there's conflict in the relationship. So they don't want to have sex under that situation. But what happens is sometimes the conflict is about not having sex. So more not having sex, the more conflict you have. And people find themselves in this loop where they can't stop and they don't know how to get off of it. So we need to understand why there's conflict, which is often about relational wounding, and then also how to interrupt the conflict, because there's a certain dynamic or certain pattern to the whole conflictual relationship, and you kind of have to nip it at different places to be able to change that dynamic. We also have to learn how to communicate with our wounds. Most of the time, actually, it's not the wounding itself, it's how we communicate our wounding, because we're all wounded in some way or another. And what gets us into trouble sometimes is what we do with that wounding, how we communicate it. So learning how to communicate in a way that's more effective is part of sex therapy. And also learning how to regulate yourself and regulate your emotions is also about sex therapy, because the lack of communication and the lack of regulation just makes wounding so much worse, creates relational conflict and distance and disappointment and resentment. And so yeah, they need to be worked in sex therapy. Lastly, sex therapy is about changing everyday behavioral things like, well, what are you doing? Like, what does life look like between the two of you? How are you inspired by each other? How are you drawn towards each other? So, going out once a week at least in order to have fun and be connected is super important. And I think if we go back to this idea of what was it like to date you for the first time, you would never go 1 week without seeing the person you're dating. It's like a weekly thing is kind of like the minimum that you would see the person that you're dating. So you want to think of this in the same way, and you would never think like, oh, I'm just going to sit on this couch and, I'm kind of in my sweats, I'm kind of smelly, and then, sex is just going to happen because it should happen. No, my first date, I'm going to think like, I'm going to look good, I'm going to smell good, I'm going to be nice, I'm going to be fun, and just to see, I want to be desirable to someone. So that's another thing that gets lost in the shuffle somehow, that we're not acting in like a first date type of mentality, but rather like I'm entitled to this no matter what. There's one more thing, which is expectations. Sexual expectations kind of screw things up because they put a lot of pressure and people get super anxious about meeting these expectations. And most of the time, these expectations are kind of unreal and not very common. So people come in all the time and I'm surprised. I think just like having some information at your fingertips, you would figure this out. But I think it's just that everybody's repeating the same stuff over and over again. Like, for example, men's obsession with having to be hard all the time, to become and stay, not only all the time, but with anybody in any place. And what that does, that expectation is like prevalent out there, especially for the male population. They adhere to this so strongly. This is what identifies their manhood. This is what identifies them to be a valuable man. And so when they are not doing that, they get into a real bad shame space, which gets them into their head and creates relational conflict and creates more and more issues because of this idea that we should be this way all the time. Men should always be ready to go at all times. And so when it doesn't happen, you feel like a piece of shit because you're not like everybody else. You can't meet what it means to be a valuable man. Sex therapy is not about just sex. It's about relational dynamics, relationship to self and relationship to others. If we're going to do really effective sex therapy, we need to address those issues as well as the sex.